Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining a special meeting, joint meeting, actually, of the Operations Management, Budget, and Government Accountability and the Labor, Educational Workforce, and Youth Committee regarding one item that we're going to be discussing. We hope that everyone had a very safe and lovely Thanksgiving with your friends and your family. My name is Councilman TJ Clark. I serve as the council's majority leader and also co-chair of the Operations Management, Budget, and Government Accountability. I am joined by my esteemed colleagues, our council president, Nally D. Rosado, who is also the co-chair of the OMBGA committee, Councilman John Q. Gale, who is a member of the OMBGA committee, as well as the only OMBGA. We have Councilwoman Marilyn Rossetti, who is a member of the Labor, Education, Workforce, and Youth Committee. We have Councilwoman Shirley Surgeon, who is a member of the OMBGA committee. We have Councilman Nick LeBron, who is the chair of the LEWY committee, as what we call it, as well as Councilman James Sanchez, who is a member of the LEWY committee. And we are joined by our colleagues from the mayor's office, Leanne Rawls, who is the director of finance, as well as Mike Lupkus, who is our budget director for the city of Hartford, our corporation counsel, Howard Rifkin, and there was one other person whom I'm not familiar with that name. But with that said, moving right along to get started, our first and only item of business for this special combined committee meeting is Mayor Bronin with a company resolution that would allow the Hartford Public Schools to establish a non-lapsing fund up to 2% of their budgeted appropriation as permitted under the Connecticut General Statute, Section 10-248A. And so we have, thank you, Maureen Coleman is joined by us. I believe she's from the Hartford Public Schools District finance team. With no other anything else, any other introductions, we can move along with the presentation by our Director of Finance, Leanne Rawls, and also to Ms. Coleman.
Council member, thanks for having me tonight to speak about 2% bid request. So I wanted to give you all a little background on this request. In August 2019, this council passed a resolution that allowed the Board of Ed to carry over FY19 surplus of approximately $2.2 million.
Ms. Rawls, I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to interrupt you. I don't know if it's just me, but from the sign that I think is my other colleagues too, we're having issues with your microphone. It keeps on going in and out.
Oh. Video and see if that helps. Is this any better?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. To give you a little history of this, back in August of 2019, this council passed a resolution that allowed the Board of Ed to carry over FY19 surplus. That surplus was approximately $2.9 million, and the resolution allowed for that surplus to be spent in FY20. The transaction that allowed that, or the statute that to happen is Connecticut General Statute 10-248A. So 10-248A allows for the Board of Education to deposit into a non-lapsing fund any spent funds from their existing budget. This amount cannot exceed 2% of the Board of Ed's total budget appropriation for education, and this has to be approved by the Court of Common Council. The funds can also only be for education purposes. So the non-lapsing fund that we use to account for these is called committed fund balance. So we allow the money to fall into general fund balance, and then we commit it so that it can be spent on education purposes. So the end of FY19 had this $2.9 million in committed fund balance, with the restriction that it has to be spent on education purposes and it has to be spent in FY20. Fast forwarding to fiscal year 20, which we're finalizing with our external auditors. COVID hit and the schools shut down in March. So what happened is the school had these savings related to the shutdown because they experienced lower costs in the last quarter of FY20. So ultimately, the Board of Ed ended fiscal 20 with a surplus of $3.9 million, just shy of $4 million. So per the accounting rules, this unspent appropriation has to be sent back to the general fund. However, the superintendent made the request to the mayor to establish up to the max 2% reserve that's allowable under Connecticut General Statute 10-248A. So the total reserve that's allowed under the statute is 2% of the board's current prior fiscal year. So because we're auditing fiscal year 20 right now, that's the year you would take 2% of their total budgeted appropriation. That amount equals $5.6 million. So the Board of Ed already has $2.9 million from FY19. So the request before you today is to roll that $2.9 million into future fiscal years and to reserve the additional $7 million from the board's FY20 surplus for a total of $0.6 million allowable under statute 10-248A. I know it's a lot of information, numbers I just threw at you, so if you need to repeat anything, please let me know.
What was the total again, please?
The total reserve allowed under the statute, $5.6 million. So it's 2% towards FY budgeted appropriation.
5.6.
Exact amount if you need it.
And what was the number for fiscal year 19?
2.9.
Okay.
Did you say 2.9?
Yep, 2.9.
Through you, Chair. So if I'm looking at the resolution that the mayor sent over, the 2019 to deposit here and surplus was $2,933,146 with 85 cents. And the non-lapsing fund totaling 2% of the fiscal year 2020 budgeted appropriations for education is $5,680,265 with 48 cents.
You got it, correct. So the request is to add to that 2%, the 2.933 reserve, $2.7 million to get to the total of 0.6.
Okay.
Council President, just already, the FY19 resolution stated that the 2.933 surplus from FY19 was to be in fiscal 20.
What?
I'm sorry, Leanne, can you repeat that again? We're still having problems hearing what you just said.
Sure. So, resolution from August of 2019 stated that the Board of Ed could reach that 2.933, but they needed to spend it in 20. So the request in 20 is to take that 0.933 and remove the frame from it so that we could just roll it forward in years with not knowing how long the pandemic will last. If the Board of Ed have unforeseen savings in FY20 that they would need to roll forward to FY1, that we would need to roll forward them the opportunity to spend the money as they need.
So I have a question, and this might be a budget question. Why is it that this is a non-lapsing line item versus a lapsing?
Statute specifically says they're allowed to carry it forward into a non-lapsing account. The only non-lapsing account that we have is fund balance.
I'm sorry, you're going to, your microphone is still messing up, so you're going to have to repeat what you just said.
I think this is Mike Lupkus. I'm sorry. Just jump in because I know her microphone's having trouble there. By the state's statute that Leanne had stated, it allows for a non-lapsing account. So in the event that it can be carried over from year to year, and then that's set by the state.
Correct.
So because how it actually normally is, correct, and correct me if I'm wrong, that if I see you, Councilman. So if there is a surplus, and I've always been told, and I've read that Board of Eds are not, if they do encounter a surplus, that is supposed to be transferred over back to the municipality into our rainy day fund.
Okay.
And if it's the will of the city, then it will be returned back to the Board of Ed. So is this the Connecticut General Statute that you're citing? Is this due to the governor's executive order, or was this something done in the special session of the Connecticut General Assembly?
No, this is an existing statute, Councilman Clark. Prior to 2018, it was capped at 1% of the Board of Ed's total appropriation, and the Board of Ed had never made a request prior to fiscal 19 to set up that reserve. So fiscal 19 was the first time, and I should also let you know, the statute was amended in July of 2018 to include up to 2% of the reserves. So it just increased the amount that the board could add to this non-lapsing fund.
Now, with the non-lapsing fund, who is responsible for managing this fund?
So it becomes part of the city's fund balance, and it will sit in the committed fund balance account, which then would require future council action for the Board of Education to spend.
And crazy question, why not keep, if there's the surplus, if the Board of Ed actually needs additional monies for COVID operations for the schools, why not just ask a request to transfer? Because clearly the budget was already set back in when we passed the new fiscal year budget. So where we are being requested to grant additional monies on top of our an already approved budget.
Maureen, do you want to answer that?
Well, I think typically when school districts have a surplus, it gets returned to the municipality because boards of education aren't allowed to carry over funds on their own. They usually get their money from the city. I think the council hasn't done that in the past if the board asked, just because of the MBR requirement. And which means if you turn around and reappropriate funds, that then becomes part of the Board of Education's budget, and then you have to meet that same amount in every succeeding year.
So by approving this this fund, we will be bound to the MDR.
This is a different situation. That this is one of the reasons why we want, I think that the city and the board's discussions was to set up the non-lapsing account, because it wouldn't commit the city to increasing the Board of Ed budget in every succeeding year. The non-lapsing account sits basically on the city side, and then the Board of Education, if they want to touch the money, have to come to the council and request permission to spend the money.
We were also informed by OPM that there was going to be legislative action that would allow cities to return these type of funds back to the Board of Ed without affecting the MBR in the next fiscal year.
Well, since we brought up the OPM, and we're going to talk about the MAR board, is this something that needs to be approved by MAR?
Not that I'm aware of, Councilman. They've been informed all along since we've been doing year-end projections that the Board of Ed would have a surplus for FY20.
Okay, all right. I'm not going to.
Councilman Clark.
Yes.
So just to clarify, the MARB is not required to approve this under the statutes that created MARB itself.
Okay. Thank you for that, Mr. Corporation Counsel. Councilman Sanchez, I saw your hand.
So I think I understand what's going on. All right. But my question is, with this pandemic, most likely it's going into next year, and we don't know if it's going to last the entire year of 2021. So if the schools are closed for the next season, now, obviously, there's no education. They're going to save this money again. Can this money be used for meals for our children in the city?
The request is that it be used for education purposes. So the statute specifically says it has to be used for education purposes. So I imagine that meals for school children would fall under education purposes. And this is also one of the reasons, Councilman Sanchez, why the request doesn't have an end date on it.
Okay.
Just to piggyback on that, I do agree with Councilman Sanchez. Is there a way that we can get some type of clarification that this money that is being requested upon could be used for meal distribution to the school population?
Maureen, correct me if I'm wrong, but the schools typically provide meals as part of the education agenda, right? So throughout the day, the Hartford public school systems are already providing meals. So if the school system does close down, similar to what happened back in March and April, May, June, the school will continue to provide meals. If they need additional funding to provide those meals, they could most definitely take it from this non-lapsing account.
Yeah.
Councilman Clark, for you, were you the one that just said if we could have in writing what these funds could be used for?
Yes.
Yes, I would also like to see that in writing.
Councilman LeBron.
Yes. So first of all, just for the public, I just got a text message. Can we? I know we like to use acronyms, and I know we're all savvy, but can someone just for the public phrase MBR? What MBR means?
It's the minimum budget requirement.
And, okay, thank you. And then the second thing is my understanding is a lapsing versus non-lapsing fund. Again, you, Mr. Chair, because it was hard to hear in and out, so I might be repeating your question. The lapsing fund and the non-lapsing fund. Non-lapsing fund is able to go in perpetuity, right? As long as we approve every year, while a lapsing fund is normally has a term limit on it, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So if that is the case with does the council, and maybe this question is for you, Mr. Rifkin, does the council have the ability to change this from a non-lapsing to a lapsing fund?
Through you, Councilman Clark. No, I don't believe so. The state statute is pretty clear about this process that is being proposed here.
So then the
I'm sorry, Councilman LeBron. If you were able to do that and essentially appropriate additional money from the fund balance to the schools, it would affect this minimum budget requirement, which is the statutory obligation of the city to support the schools by a certain dollar amount. And if our appropriation increased as a result of this, treating a fund balance as an appropriation, we would then increase our annual minimum budget requirement.
Got it. So following up on that, because I know that I see my council colleagues, I know there's other questions, but this underspending was as a result of the COVID-19. We are now going into a new year where we have a quarter of savings from COVID-19, I would imagine. And then moving forward, there is an anticipated savings from COVID-19. Is there a projection that we're going to be back at the table again, adding more money to this non-lapsing fund next year? And that's for whoever has that information.
Yeah. Councilman LeBron, the non-lapsing fund is capped at 2% of the Board of Education's total appropriation for whatever fiscal year that we're in audit at time. So if they already have the $5.6 million and there's no change to the budget for fiscal 21, 22, whichever year in the future that we're discussing, then the unspent surplus would just return back to the city, because by statute, we can't exceed the 2% of the total of budget.
My understanding, so this non-lapsing budget, what it does is it's capped at 2%, but what the district, what the board is trying to do, or the Hartford Public Schools is trying to do, is create kind of an emergency rainy day fund with this money, that if you eventually need it at that 2%, because that's the maximum. Is that what's being done? And then number one, and then number two, has this been normal standard practice over time when there has been funds? And let me tell you the genesis of my question. The reason why I'm asking that is that $5.6 million is a lot of money. And there are essential services, there are other things that are going on. And I absolutely wholeheartedly believe in education and educational services. But, during these times, we're all in this together. And so if there are opportunities to, share, I'm just trying to look into that as to, is this the normal standard practice where we keep 2%, or is this new? And so if you can answer that.
Sure. So the statute's been around for a while, so that's given municipalities the ability to create either a 1% or a 2% reserve. So the statute was updated in 2018 to an increased 2%. In speaking with the external auditors this year, there were many municipalities that they are auditing that are in the same situation that the Hartford Public School System is in, and that they weren't able to spend their total appropriation due to the pandemic. So it's a pretty common issue that's happening throughout the state, per the auditors.
Okay, so just for the second part of the question, and this will be my last one through you, Mr. Chair. So this hasn't been a standard practice previously because there hasn't really been surplus funds, right? This hasn't been a kind of standard operating procedure.
Correct. So
Yes.
historically, the Board of Ed either spends their entire appropriation or they transfer back to the cities like immaterial dollar amounts, less than $10,000, less than $20,000. So we always have a little bit of a transfer coming back to the city every year. This request would take from their 3.9, just shy of $4 million surplus, 2.7. It would take 2.7 out of that amount, and it would increase their already existing reserve up to the 2% max. So the city would still end up with a residual surplus from the Board of Ed of about 1.2 million.
So, so basically you transfer back because when it's a nominal amount, or I forgot what language you use, who makes it this immaterial amount, excuse me. Who makes that distinction at what's the threshold where the amount designation becomes immaterial?
Well, materiality based on the external audit, which is this whole process that this transaction is happening through, for the city's general fund is set at $1 million. Typically, if it's over $50,000, then I would bring it to the mayor and the executive leadership to make a decision as to whether or not we need to do any further action on the city side. But it hasn't exceeded that dollar amount.
Thank you for your patience and answering all my questions.
No problem.
Councilman Gale.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. So just to kind of go back and summarize, the minimum budget requirement, what was referred to as the MBR, is the amount of money that City Council has to appropriate every year for the Board of Education's budget. And by law, once that amount is set one year, the next year you can't go below it. You could go above it, but you can't go below it. Am I correct?
You can go below, but you can't go above, correct?
It's the other way around, isn't it?
So you can have less than 2%. Currently, the Board of Ed has.
I'm just talking about the MBR, the straight amount.
Yes, correct.
So
correct.
The straight amount that we budget for the Board of Education, if we set it, pick a number, if we set it at 200 million, we can never go below that amount.
Correct.
And so having this additional fund allows the Board of Education to spend above the amount that we've budgeted without coming back to the city and asking us to budget more money.
Correct.
And the amount you said is 2%. So once it's funded, and apparently it would be fully funded this year, if I'm understanding you, that based on this transfer, this non-lapsing fund would now be fully funded at 2% of the budget. If the budget never changed, there would be no further additional monies going into this fund unless they somehow depleted it.
Correct.
And I think then, to Councilman LeBron's point, it sounds like in essence, this is the legislature's way of providing boards of education with a little rainy day fund, so they don't have to go back to their councils if they run into trouble, and their councils don't have to worry about increasing their MBR. Does that sound about right?
Sounds right to me, Councilman.
And one other acronym that people may not have understood, since the question was asked, there was reference to the MARB, M-A-R-B, and that is the Municipal Accountability Review Board, which has been supervising the city's finances for approximately 3 to 4 years now. Mike, is that about right on that too?
I believe it's since 2018.
18, right?
2018. Okay. All right. So that's and the answer was that the MARB doesn't weigh in on this. We can certainly do this and not run afoul of any state review of our budget.
Correct.
And the good news is that even if we fully fund this, the city's still going to get $1.2 million back.
You got it, Councilman.
All right. Thank you very much.
So if I can just get a little bit more clarity, and I believe I asked this question earlier. If this, just hypothetically speaking, if this may not be approved and the Board of Ed needs additional money for educational purposes for COVID operation, and if they request through the mayor to the city council for additional monies to be transferred over, such as what we already do with additional internally with other departments regarding fourth quarter transfers and things of that nature, that transfer, requested transfer, that would affect our MBR?
I believe so, Councilman Clark.
Can we get, I'm sorry to be so technical, but can we get an absolute clarity whether that hypothetical transfer of funds request would affect the MBR?
Councilman Clark, if I may, the statute that covers MBR uses the word appropriation in the calculation of what the minimum budget requirement is. If rather than do this, creating this committed fund balance dedicated to the Board of Education, you were to appropriate additional funds to support the fact that the board may be running a deficit, that additional appropriation would then count in the future towards the city's minimum budget requirement.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Councilman Sanchez?
So, knowing the situation with the pandemic, what's the projected savings for next year?
Are you speaking for fiscal 21, Councilman Sanchez, or fiscal 20? Fiscal 21. Mike, do you want to take that question?
Well, yes, as a matter of fact, I'll say for both 20 and 21. For the second half.
On the city side, we are monitoring each month on our forecast that we end up sending to the MARB, the accountability report. And in there is our forecast, which picks up for whether it's vacancies or some of the expenses that are not spent throughout the year. As far as the Board of Education, I don't know if there is a forecast at this point. On the board side, do you want to handle that one, or?
Maureen?
I can look it up real quick if you want to just hang on.
Sure.
While Maureen is looking, is there Is there any interest growing in this account? In this non-lapsing account?
There is no interest specifically accruing in this account, no. It's the committed fund balance account. So the total cash is sitting in the city's main pooled cash account, which is under Treasurer Cloud's management. So however he manages the interest associated with the pooled cash account would continue to move forward, but any results from that interest income would not increase the non-lapsing account.
And this non-lapsing account was managed by the Board of Ed and not the City of Hartford Treasurer's Office, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Years ago, the OPEB.
No, I'm sorry, Councilman, I misspoke there. The non-lapsing account would be controlled by the City Finance Department. Requests from the Board of Ed would go to City Finance and then would have to come back in front of City Council before they could spend it.
Now, can you just give us a brief history lesson on how was the OPEB trust account formed? Wasn't that formed under from the Board of Ed?
Correct. So the OPEB trust account is, it was created under the management of Treasurer Cloud. And it's set up similar to the pension account in that the Pension Commission has oversight of the OPEB trust account as well. So that is a physical trust at a bank. This non-lapsing account for the Board of Education is really part of the city's fund balance. So it sits on our balance sheet, right, which is a complete listing of the city's assets, the city's liabilities, and then this overall rainy day fund. So because it's part of that fund balance account, it would be managed by City Finance Department.
Now,
and it's not a true cash account.
Okay, so since it's not a true cash account and how the funds are set up, the rating agencies would not look at the city's books to show that with this non-lapsing account, given that we will be sitting on this money, they would not be likely to increase our bond rating.
Well, overall, it's an increase to the city's fund balance, which is a good thing for rating agencies. But as part of that fund balance, it will show a restriction to be spent only on education purposes.
Okay.
But this,
Go ahead, Councilman.
so I think being that it would be a positive addition to funds, that it would increase our credit status here in the city of Hartford. Going back to my last question, I also would like to know this savings that we're having a conversation about, is this just on the city's side of what funds we've given to the Board of Ed? Because if I'm not mistaken, they also receive funds from the state side, and also I believe they have to spend the municipal funds before the federal fund, correct?
Correct. So the Board of Ed receives multiple funding sources, the 280 plus million from the city. That's part of the city's general fund budget, which is the city's overall contribution, which is about $98 million. And I apologize if my numbers are a little off. And then the remaining amount comes from what we call the ECS grant. That comes directly to the city. We transfer it to the board. That's all in part of the Board of Ed's annual appropriation. The Board of Ed manages those funds in what we call the Board of Ed General Fund. And at the end of every year, those are the funds that need to be spent down to zero, or the residual comes back to the city. The Board of Ed also has a grant fund where they manage their federal and state grants in. And correct me if I'm wrong, Maureen, but I believe that several of the Board of Ed grants extended their spending deadlines because of the pandemic. So if it was a one-year grant, it was extended to be spent in 2 years. So we looked at the order of spending, Councilman Sanchez, to make sure that the Board of Ed was following the accounting rules. We reviewed the transactions with the external auditors, and everything is on board.
Okay, thank you for that. And did we get the information on the future savings?
Our finances haven't been fully audited yet, but the year-end financial report, the last one we produced, it showed around approximately a $5 million surplus for fiscal year 19-20.
Okay, thank you.
So
I'm sorry, Councilman, can I jump in there? Sorry, Maureen.
Yeah.
The FY20 surplus for the Board of Ed was, I can tell you the exact amount, $3,978,33.88. That's the full amount that was transferred back to the city general fund. I just don't know what the FY21 projection is for the Board of Ed.
Okay.
yeah, I think that's what Councilman said. Sorry, Councilman.
Wait. And I want to make sure everybody gets a turn to speak. Councilwoman Surgeon.
Yeah, I was just trying to follow along with that. My only really question is, did I hear correctly, Leanne, that this non-lapsing fund will be transferred to the city committed budget, specific just for the Board of Education, and whatever monies that are going to be needed back to the school board, do you need to come back to council for approval?
Correct. So it would reside in the city's committed fund balance account, which would require council action to be spent in the future.
And then my second question is, so you're doing fiscal year 19 and also fiscal year 2020?
Correct.
For a total of $5 million to this committed fund balance account.
Correct. So the Board of Ed has approximately 1%, or the $2.933 million from fiscal 19 already sitting in a committed fund balance account. That $2.9 million was restricted by the council resolution to be spent in FY20. So the request before you today is to remove that time frame and allow it to be non-lapsing in the future.
Because the legislation has changed.
Correct. Because the Board of Ed is allowed to have a maximum of 2%. Since they already have this about 1% amount sitting in committed fund balance, we'd like to roll it forward into the 2% max non-lapsing account.
Instead of giving back the city the 1.2 million.
They will still give the city the 1.2 million out of their 3.9 total. So it's 3.9.
Okay.
Minus the 2.7, which would get the Board of Ed up to the 5.6 max. The residual is 1.2. That would stay with the city.
Okay. Basically, all that's going to be in the committed funds is a 5.6.
Correct.
And the city gets back to their general fund 1.2 million.
Correct.
And if we go back into fiscal year 2020 and we still have an additional, if the school boards have additional savings, are you going to come back to council again for this 2% non-lapsing fund just in case?
If the 2% is approved, Councilwoman, then that would be the max that they would be allowed to have. So if there's any changes, let's say from an audit adjustment, then that amount would just reside with the city.
So year that the board does not spend their entire appropriation, and they may have an additional monies in their non-lapsing funds, would the legislation require the board to come back to the city since you already have that the 2% already in there. If fiscal year 2020, there is additional funds, you would increase that committed funds anymore. Those monies would have to come back to the city.
Correct.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Councilman LeBron.
Yes, so I think Councilman, just to reiterate Councilman Sanchez's question, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Councilman Sanchez, through you, Mr. Chair, was the projected savings under COVID for the end of FY21. But were you able to find that at all, Maureen?
I'm looking for Dave's latest projection, and I haven't found it. So
okay. So with that being said,
I was going to say, I assume I can find it. Look for him tomorrow, and we could just send it over to you.
Yes, that would be great. So would it be safe to assume that if there were savings between March and June, which is, let's say, a quarter of the year, that equaled the 3.9 million or whatever savings? And I know 1.2 million came back to the city. Would it be safe to assume that you times that same amount by 4 to represent all 4 quarters of a fiscal year? Or is my math off? I'm using back of the envelope math, so please forgive me.
Councilman, I believe the Board of Ed has some cyclical spending, so they incur spending at the start of the school year. So I don't believe that it's evenly spent in all 4 quarters. But Maureen, can you?
Yeah, it's not. You can't really say it's equal amounts in every quarter. We do the bulk of our purchasing, over the summer prior to the start of the school year. I know that this year, to get the schools reopened, there was a lot of expenses on PPE and all the things necessary to, open the schools for the students. So, as they've gone to a hybrid model, there's less expense on things like substitute teachers, part-time employees, that type of thing. But then, like, as cases, as people test positive and they have to close the schools to do the cleaning, the expenses shift to custodians. So it's very, very difficult to say it's the same every 4 quarters.
Thank you, Maureen. So the last one, I know we're coming up on time. So through you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your patience. So the process with these fund savings during the year, is it a process that you have to wait to the year-end balance to then decide how you're going to spend that fund? My understanding is that if you have the educational needs, that you could spend it during the year. That's the intent, correct? Is that correct, Maureen?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So with that being said, if the community, let's say this past year, had a need in May or June, or expressed a desire to keep a school open, let's say, for example, and was told that there was no extra monies to be able to keep that school open, in actuality, these funds could have been used for that, correct? The question is, do facilities or the maintainment of facilities come as an educational cost? Like, is it part of that educational allowance for costs for facilities?
The day-to-day operations of the schools are, but like long-term, school construction, that's totally different. The big renovation projects where they have to go to the Hartford School Building Committee, that's different again.
Okay. So basically, if I'm hearing correctly, so construction costs are out of the question, but if you have a facility and you can pay the costs of running that facility, that would be an educational cost, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So therefore, if a request comes up during the year we as a council body for this FY21, we can pivot back to these potential cost savings in alignment with the district and in partnership, and see if these funds could be spent for this next year, let's say for facilities or a whole bunch of computers or whatever, the partnership decides. That's correct?
Well, that would be something that would have to be discussed between the council and the board.
Thank you so much, Maureen. I know that was that wasn't a layup per se, but just curious as to the amount of influence and the possibilities of pivoting these monies, particularly if it's going to a non-lapsing fund and it's done in perpetuity, because we gave back $1.2 million for the city. And even if we had this rainy day fund, that $1.2 million could have been used during a year to address whatever community concerns they may have had.
Yeah, that's not a decision that would be made at my level. I think the intent of the non-lapsing account is if the Board of Education finds itself in a situation where they have costs that are higher than what was budgeted. So for instance, I'll give you an example, special education out of district tuition. If the board finds that they have more students being placed out of district, and it's more than what was budgeted, this would be a type of item that the board would come to the council for and say, we'd like to take some of the money out of the non-lapsing account and put that towards our higher than expected special education tuition costs.
Thank you so much.
Just to, because I know we're running short on time. Councilman, I see you. I'm going to call you. Just to back just a little bit to Councilman LeBron's point regarding what's actually covered under, what will be covered under these funds as deemed educational. Can you alluded to, you mentioned some of the expenses such as special education, which I think is very important regarding our children who are bused out to other school districts, but are paid through by Hartford Public Schools. What can you just give us a real overview as to what other funds would be covered under under this pot of money?
Is that for me?
Yes.
That would be a decision that I think the superintendent and the Board of Education would make to you. Okay.
Councilman Sanchez?
Yes, I have more or less what Councilman, and thank you through you, Chair, what Majority Leader Clark had mentioned. Going to rephrase it, would there be any moment where the superintendent or the Board of Education will not be required to address the council to use some of those money? And this question is for Howard and you, Ms. Coleman.
So the quick answer is,
I was going to say
sorry, Maureen, go ahead.
I was going to say my understanding of the non-lapsing accounts are if it's decided that this is to be set up, once the money is there, the Board of Education has to request the funds from the council, and the council has to approve it.
For any purpose that they deem necessary.
Well,
yes,
it has to be for an educational purpose, and I think that was part of the conversation about what does that in fact mean. But to answer your question, Councilman Sanchez, and to confirm what Maureen was just saying, absolutely no money can be spent from this non-lapsing committed fund balance without the approval of the City Council.
Thank you.
Councilman Gale?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to clarify one thing. so that hopefully we're all clear about it. Maureen, for you, if the Board of Education has savings in this upcoming year, all of that savings will end up coming back to the city because they're fully funded in their non-lapsing fund, correct?
Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't know, Mr. Chair, if I'm a member of one committee and not both. So, I'd like to make a motion to send this back to council at this point. Would that be in order, or do you want to hear it from somebody who's on both committees?
No, well, Councilman, to your point, can somebody mute the phone? Just dial in. Or the host.
Council President, could you mute their phone?
Thank you. No, to okay, I just got muted. To answer your I'm not a member of both committees either, but since this is a special committee meeting, we all have a vote. So I would believe, unless I am incorrect, that your motion will be in order. But before you make a motion, I just want to make sure that does anybody else have any questions for the budget and finance team? Seeing none, Councilman Gale.
Yeah, it certainly strikes me, having heard everything, that there's some benefit to allowing the board the degree of flexibility. And really what it does, it strikes me, is that we as a city don't have to worry about where additional funds would come from if a need arose. Without this fund, if a need arose, we would have to look into our budget and perhaps go into a deficit situation in order to fund a special need that the board had. But now we're setting up essentially a rainy day fund. I think Chairman LeBron used that term, and I think that's probably pretty accurate. So in any event, I would move to send this back to council with a favorable recommendation, Mr. Chair.
Is there a second? Is there a second? Is there a second? All right, since there's no second, the chair would, Councilman Sanchez.
I'm not seconding it. I do have a motion.
The chair will entertain a motion.
I'd like to make a motion to send it to council with no recommendation.
The motion has been made by Councilman Sanchez to send it back to City Council with no recommendation. Is there a second?
Second.
Second.
Been properly motioned by Councilman Sanchez and seconded by Councilman Gale to send this resolution back to the council with no recommendation. Is there any discussion on this? Seeing none, all in favor to send this item back to City Council with no recommendation, raise your hand by saying aye.
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 All right, it looks like the ayes have it. It is a unanimous decision to send this item back to the City Council for our next council meeting, which will be on December 14th with no recommendation. Thank you very much. Since there is no other business to discuss for this special meeting of the OMBGA and LEWY, as we commonly call it, thank you very much to everyone for joining in. Thank you to Ms. Golupkis, Ms. Rawls, and Ms. Coleman for your presentation. This special committee meeting, and also to Attorney Rifkin. This special committee meeting is now adjourned. Council members, don't go too far. We have a committee of the whole meeting coming up.
Exactly. All right. Good night, everyone.
Goodbye.